traditionally, the Section 8 housing vouchers, which we mentioned a little bit throughout our presentation, have been sort of the primary federal grant that is a housing subsidy that allows those with very low income to rent housing at a level that it works for them. But what's happened recently is that the waiting lists for these vouchers have gone on to the point where if you are on that waiting list, you will not get a voucher, and so sort of those funds have already been used up. And also in New York, for example, the housing voucher waiting list is now closed to new applicants. So the previous solution is no longer something that can be used nowadays. So there needs to be other ways of finding affordable housing.
I think also in the past 5 years, it's been pressure from the constituents, especially, to figure out the issue. Whether some of them don't want it to be done in their backyard, but they want something to be done about it. For instance, Hawaii, not only constituents, but tourists were complaining. They would come in and they would go on Waikiki Beach and they would see camps, and tourism is a big industry for Hawaii. So there's been outside pressure, there's been media, there's a new emergence of how this is not just an issue that just happens. This is something that we need to take care of, or else it's going to ruin our way of life. And I think that the outside pressure is especially a reason why things have progressed in 5 years.
I think along those lines, you can't really ignore simply the political climate in terms of things like Occupy Wall Street, where we mentioned gentrification and this huge disparity between the highest income earners and the lowest income earners, and it's not specific to Silicon Valley at all. Obviously, it was a nationwide campaign, and so it's really come to the limelight in that sense, and in the moral part that Daniel was mentioning in the very first section.
The New York Times coincidentally had a big article today on homelessness and the alleged success of something called the 100,000 Homes Corporation. There's a very vague description of what it is that they're doing that they claim to be successful. It sounds a lot like stuff you've talked about this afternoon. The only one you didn't mention that's in the article is a triage that's done by volunteers between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. each day, in which they get to know individual homeless people and assess their vulnerability. And then allocate available housing, which is insufficient to house the entire homeless population, to the most vulnerable, and not worrying about eligibility under various grant criteria. Did you come across that at all?
Yeah, so VISPADAT actually is the survey that's used by 100,000 Homes. And as Colin talked to me, he said there's 3 levels of acuity. He goes, you need to figure out who is the most vulnerable. It's not about who's eligible or whatever, because these are the people that are causing the issues that everyone sees. It's the people who are fine to live in tents their whole life. It's the people that have been in and out of jail. And what VISPADAT and 100,000 Homes did, Hawaii's using what 100,000 Homes has done, is just kind of bring all those different faces of homelessness into one survey so they can kind of get an assessment of how they are, not just health-wise, not just housing-wise, but just who they are as a person. And that's part of that risk assessment. And then in addition to the 1 to 3 a.m., Colin told me that they want to go from a bottom-up approach. They want to continue to have the people who have been in these services for a long time, for the nonprofit sectors and the faith organizations. And these are the people who are really interfacing with the homeless. I mean, you can talk about an organization, you can make a committee, but building trust with these people and getting them into a home is a whole different story, right? So that's another part of the organization, and I'm going to read this article today.
So it strikes me that the strategy of only looking at rich communities comparable to Silicon Valley may have been less productive than looking at communities of whatever characteristic where there has been a successful effort, if there are any, to reduce homelessness, because the techniques used may not have all that much to do with the wealth of the community. It may have more to do with the organizational structure of the effort to deal with homelessly in an effective way.
In our preliminary research, we did examine a large number of cities that didn't necessarily have high housing rates. I, for example, researched Houston, and while housing, the average price of a home there is somewhere around $230,000, I believe in 2012 there was nearly a 50% reduction in the number of people living on the streets, and a lot of proponents of this success say that that was due to the mayor's efforts in galvanizing public support and making it sort of a important platform of her candidacy and of time as an elected official. So when I guess a lot of the lower cost areas, we did find strategies that could be applied to these higher cost areas that our client was adamant that we pursue.
Yeah. Well, it's easy to see that political leadership is useful. What's not so clear is the mechanism by which it gets translated into effective action.
Well, one of the things you said your client was interested in is different models of cooperation and collaboration, and so you've presented a number of different models and walked through them. If your client asks, okay, we have these different models, but now how do we decide what's best for us? Do you have suggestions, or is it how they can make that step? Should they take pieces of different ones, or they?
I think all of us can agree that we all have like a certain plan, right? But you need to have. I think they need to hire somebody. They need to put money to someone. Like we said, like you need to have someone who thinks about this. And while you can have the director of housing and the director of employment and emergency services all come together, there's no real responsibility put on them. They're like a task force, and we agree that if you throw a task force at something, it doesn't necessarily come out. Colin Kippen, the coordinator, when he talked to me, he said his job literally comes down to coordinating and allocating resources. So he's like literally knows the right people to call. He knows how to approach these people who have their own initiatives, right? And it takes those certain types of people to be within your organization. In terms of, I don't know, what do you guys think?
I think it's a combination. I mean, the client is already heading in the direction of creating a JPA, and they've had initial conversations with the body within the county that makes those decisions and can allocate that kind of power. But they're asking us to kind of give them feedback on how they should staff it, how much money should be allocated to it. And I think what it comes down to is, when you look at something like in Honolulu, we have Colin Kippen, who has the authority, but not really and the care, but not really the power to allocate the money and the resources. On the other side of things, in New York City, we have this huge dedicated amount of money that's going toward homelessness, but you don't have the formal power structure there. You have Bill de Blasio, who's kind of championing the initiative, but there's not someone who has the authority to say, you report to me, you have to do this. And so I think it's a combination of the two. You have to have the resources, which we've talked about, and you have to have the formal power authority. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Our recommendation to the client isn't a specific structure. I don't think they had hoped that we could tell them a specific structure, and after doing our case studies, I think we feel very strongly that we couldn't recommend a specific structure to them. It's more that we believe that there are certain elements that need to be part of the structure in order for it to be successful, and those are what we outlined in our observation section.
It sounded to me like you had sort of the idea of is that somebody needs to be in charge and somebody needs to be responsible, but I was struck by the Washington, D.C. one. It's like, only in Washington, D.C. would you have 14 different agencies trying to coordinate in a city. So you might want to mention, play a little bit more if you think about, if that's what you believe, that, that you need to get buy-in, but you don't necessarily need 14 different agencies all having power. It seems like that might be part of your recommendation or something you think about.
Well, that was actually one of the things that struck us is that in all of these cities, in New York as well, there are 13 different agencies that will be a part of it, and that at least something I didn't realize before this project was that it actually is necessary to coordinate all of those agencies, because each of them is involved in a different step of both the homelessness, shelter, and permanent affordable housing process. And so that is sort of the key challenge, is how to organize.
Yeah, and I can speak more to the DC if you're if you're at all curious. But I wouldn't necessarily say that they all had that power. It was more coming together to try and figure out how we can coordinate our approaches, and then from there having a group recommendation for goals for, this agency should fund 500 permanent housing units or stuff like that. So but I agree it is a difficult aspect of this, is that there are so many agencies that kind of touch the issue, but how do you really form a sort of central unit that dictates it down so you don't have a massive confusion and in the end sort of inactivity, which is what we've seen a lot in the past.
I mean, sometimes thinking about the organization of how you would address these issues might be something that you would address with the client. I think you kind of gave it the structure, but you didn't kind of say, here are the things we saw and how it might, that you need to coordinate all these agencies and you need to have somebody in charge. Some a little bit more concrete in your recommendations that way.
I was struck too, what are the mechanisms for the political champion? I think in all the states that y'all mentioned, and of course District of Columbia not so much being relevant in this regard, the mayor and the governor were of the same political parties in New York, in California, and Hawaii. And the Houston situation, do y'all know if that's bipartisan governorship and mayorship?
It was.
That might be interesting for the client to say, this, you've got the wind at your back if you happen to have bipartisanship. I can imagine the mayor and governor are going to be looking out for each other's interests on this unpopular issue. But if you've got places where that's not necessarily an impediment, where it works even if the two parties are not necessarily looking out for each other, that might be useful to say you can still do it.
San Jose's mayor doesn't declare a party.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. It's a nonpartisan election. Everybody knows what their parties are, but there's no party apparatus that puts candidates for.
Cool.
There's a dimension to the homelessness problem which you have ignored, I think, because of your essentially exclusive focus on the agencies responsible for homelessness. And there's a whole other set of agencies responsible for anti-homelessness. They're the ones who create it. And it seems to me that if you're going to assess the potential effectiveness of policies, you have to take into account the more general development strategies and business development strategies of the city. The San Diego issue, which is you build Petco Park and destroy 10,000 housing units, and then you come back and say we'll build 500 homeless shelters, right? I mean, on balance, San Diego has reduced the stock of housing for homelessness, not increased it when you take account of all of their policies. And I think the same thing is true probably of Seattle, but I'm not as sure about that as I am of San Diego. So it seems to me that there's an information bias in your results that has to do with focusing on the entities that want to do something about the problem and that to the exclusion of the entities in the same governments that actually want to make the problem worse.
And I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. I think we all do. And we don't want to punt that question, but I think that the reason our research took the direction that it did is because we brought that up multiple times with the client, and they specifically asked us to move in a direction away from affordable housing projects and where to focus affordable housing projects, and then toward the structure. I mean, I think the one plus side is that if they're successful in implementing a powerful committee on homelessness, then that can be their next step in terms of addressing how to fix those problems. But that's the reason why it wasn't present in our presentation.
Yeah, because when we went out to talk to them, we were asking the same questions we were talking about. So you want us to figure out how to best approach affordable housing, which is not necessarily a homeless issue. It's just how do you get better paying jobs? How do you get lower? How do you get community leaders like policemen and teachers to live in your community? Like now they have to travel from across because they can't even afford their homes. I know in Hawaii, for instance, one of the council members I talked to, he said that affordable housing in itself is a politically toxic issue. So it's harder, but homelessness, helping the homeless is not as toxic, but build development on an island that's limited, and people want their white picket fence, and their home, not just, they don't want to be densely populated. Those are harder issues, and I guess that they're doing, I guess like you said, a roundabout approach.
Well, I mean, I think you've taken the don't look at affordable housing thing a bit too far, in the sense that what you're focusing on is there's this growing homeless population. And then we have, one could say, a bunch of Band-Aids, right, to deal with a problem that is much bigger than the Band-Aids, and where local government policies in other dimensions have contributed more to the problem than the solution that can be anticipated from the scale and scope of the programs you're observing. And so it just seems to me that that whole context of how local government policies in general, starting with zoning, starting with enterprise zones. I mean, enterprise zones in California are a big deal, and San Jose has made huge use of them. And one of their consequences, of course, is to create homelessness. So, assessing the net effect of the local governments on homelessness as opposed to the gross effects of some Band-Aid policies strikes me as not necessarily the best way to go.
It's a really important observation. I think it's really helpful. I think you should work that in for the client.
Sure.
As an overarching observation before you launch into the specific question.